On the snowy streets of Chicago, amid the glow of festive lights and the warmth of holiday cheer, a once powerful millionaire faces the harsh chill of betrayal and despair. Roberto Johnson, known as the Shark of Chicago, had it all: wealth, influence, and control, until the night it all came crashing down. Left with nothing but the weight of his downfall, Roberto finds himself wandering aimlessly through a humble neighborhood, far from the skyscrapers that once defined his world. Here, among strangers who celebrate Christmas with modesty and genuine warmth, his journey takes an unexpected turn. A street musician with a battered guitar, a baker with a heart of gold, and a community bound by resilience offer Roberto a glimpse of what he never knew he was missing. But can a man who built his life on ambition and power truly change? As snow falls gently over Main Street, a series of small yet profound moments unfold, moments that could either reignite the fire of hope in Roberto's heart or leave him lost in the shadows of his past. This is the story of a millionaire brought to his knees by fate, and the Christmas miracle that might just save his soul. Roberto Johnson sat in the towering glass office that had become his throne. The Chicago skyline stretched out before him, glittering in the pale winter sun. On his desk lay the documents for yet another acquisition, a deal that would solidify his reputation as one of the sharpest minds in corporate America. Known as the Shark of Chicago, Roberto thrived on his ability to identify weaknesses and capitalize on them with precision. His fortune, built on mergers and acquisitions, was both admired and feared. Today, he expected nothing less than another resounding victory. The phone call came in sharply, breaking his concentration. It wasn't unusual for his line to buzz with urgency, but there was something different in the assistant's voice. The calm, composed tone Roberto demanded of his staff was absent. Her voice wavered, and the words spilled out in an almost inaudible rush. Fernando was gone. At first, Roberto didn't understand. He replayed her words in his mind, as if their meaning might change. Fernando, his partner, his closest confidant in business, had vanished. Along with him had disappeared a significant portion of the firm's capital, money that was not only theirs but that of countless investors. The assistant's voice trembled as she mentioned the emails left unanswered, the office computer wiped clean, and the safe deposit emptied. The cold began to seep into Roberto's chest, tightening like a vice. He leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the ceiling as the enormity of the betrayal settled in. Fernando, the man he had trusted like a brother, had not only abandoned him but also left him exposed. The debts, the liabilities, the unfiled reports, everything Roberto had depended on Fernando to manage, were now unraveling, threatening to bury him. Before he could fully process the betrayal, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was the press office. Reporters were swarming outside the building. News of Fernando's disappearance had already leaked, and headlines mocking Roberto's downfall were spreading like wildfire. Words like embezzlement, investigation, and downfall of the shark danced in bold letters on his computer screen as he scanned the early reports. That he couldn't afford to panic, not yet. He had survived crises before. But this was different. His hands clenched the edge of his desk as he tried to steady himself. He was Roberto Johnson, a man who had built empires, who had thrived in the face of adversity. Surely, there was a way out of this. Standing abruptly, he paced the office, his mind racing. His once imposing presence seemed smaller now, the weight of humiliation pressing down on him. He barked orders at his assistant, demanding updates and solutions, but deep down, he knew this was a battle he wasn't prepared for. The Shark of Chicago, a title once spoken with awe, was now being dragged through the mud. The day passed in a blur of frantic calls and desperate meetings. By evening, Roberto was exhausted, his confidence eroded by the endless stream of bad news. Regulators were circling, investors were demanding answers, and his reputation was crumbling before his eyes. As the city lights flickered on outside his office window, Roberto found himself staring at his reflection. For the first time, he saw not the indomitable figure he had cultivated, but a man lost and vulnerable. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was personal. Fernando had been more than a partner. He had been a friend, someone Roberto had shared victories with, someone he had trusted without question. The memories began to flood back: late-night discussions over whiskey, Fernando's unwavering support during difficult deals, the shared vision of building something unparalleled. Now, all of it felt like a cruel joke. Roberto couldn't understand how he had missed the signs. Had there been warnings? Subtle hints of Fernando's discontent or greed that he had ignored? The knock on the door startled him. His assistant entered hesitantly, placing a folder on his desk. It contained the latest financial statements, each line more damning than the last. Roberto waved her away without a word, unable to bear the pity in her eyes. He opened the folder slowly, as if delaying the inevitable. The numbers confirmed what he already knew: he was ruined. As he sat there, the weight of the day pressing down on him, the world outside seemed to mock him. The festive glow of Christmas lights illuminated the streets, their cheerfulness a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. The laughter of families and the jingle of carolers echoed faintly from below, a reminder of a world he no longer felt part of. Roberto Johnson, the man who had conquered industries and commanded respect, was now a headline, a scandal, a cautionary tale. And in the silence of his once bustling office, he couldn't help but wonder if there was anything left to salvage, not just of his fortune, but of himself. The streets of Chicago were a cold, unwelcoming maze as Roberto Johnson wandered aimlessly through them. The icy wind cut through his coat, and the cheerful holiday decorations lining the sidewalks felt like a cruel joke. Wreaths hung from lampposts, their bright red ribbons fluttering, while garlands and strings of golden lights framed the shop windows. It was the eve of Christmas, a time when the city transformed into a postcard-perfect scene. But to Roberto, it was nothing more than a hollow display of cheer mocking his descent into chaos. Each step felt heavier than the last as he moved through the bustling sidewalks. He passed smiling families clutching shopping bags, their faces glowing with anticipation of the holiday. Children darted around, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. Roberto kept his head down, his shoulders hunched, hoping to escape the gaze of anyone who might recognize him. The shark of Chicago had become prey, a man desperate to disappear into the crowd. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibrations a constant reminder of the life he was trying to flee. He pulled it out, staring at the screen without answering. The calls came in relentlessly, investors demanding explanations, reporters asking for comments, even former allies reaching out, either to feign sympathy or to distance themselves from the wreckage. He shoved the phone back into his coat pocket and continued walking, letting the icy wind whip across his face. His thoughts circled endlessly, replaying the events that had led him here. Fernando's betrayal wasn't just a wound, it was a fracture in the foundation of everything Roberto had built. The years of relentless ambition, sleepless nights, and calculated risks now seemed meaningless. He had thought of himself as invincible, a master of his destiny. But one man, one act of treachery, had unraveled it all in a matter of hours. As he wandered, Roberto found himself drawn to streets he hadn't visited in years. These weren't the polished avenues of downtown Chicago, lined with luxury boutiques and five-star hotels. Instead, the roads became narrower, the lights dimmer, the decorations more modest. He didn't recognize the names of the stores or the faces of the people bustling past him. This wasn't his world, but it felt oddly grounding to be in a place where no one knew him, where his name held no weight. The cold began to seep into his bones, and Roberto realized he had been walking for hours. His expensive leather shoes, polished to perfection that morning, were now scuffed and damp from the dirty snow piling on the sidewalks. He turned onto a quieter street, hoping to find some reprieve from the biting wind. The hum of the city seemed to fade, replaced by the faint sound of carolers singing in the distance. Ahead of him, Main Street came into view. The name struck him as almost comically generic, a place that could belong to any small town in America. But as he stepped onto the street, something about it felt different. The decorations here were simple, strings of lights zigzagging between buildings, handmade ornaments hanging from trees, and candles flickering in the windows of tiny shops. Families gathered on doorsteps, laughing and sharing food, their warmth radiating into the chilly night. Roberto slowed his pace, observing the scene with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. It was so far removed from his reality, a world driven by power and profit. These people had so little, yet they seemed genuinely content. A group of children ran past him, giggling as they chased each other with makeshift snowballs. A young couple walked arm in arm, sharing a thermos of steaming hot chocolate. Roberto couldn't remember the last time he had witnessed such unfiltered joy that he stopped in front of a small bakery, the smell of freshly baked bread wafting out into the street. Through the frosted window, he could see a family inside, gathered around a table covered in pastries. The bakery was dimly lit, but the glow of the candles on the table gave the scene an almost ethereal quality. For a moment, Roberto felt an ache he couldn't quite name. It wasn't jealousy or regret, it was something deeper, a longing for a simplicity he had long forgotten. The ache deepened as he walked further down Main Street. Everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of what he had sacrificed. A father hoisted his daughter onto his shoulders so she could hang an ornament on a tree. A group of friends gathered around a fire pit, their faces lit with the soft orange glow of the flames. Even the carolers, their voices slightly off-key, seemed to exude a kind of warmth that had been absent from Roberto's life for decades. That he paused on the corner, leaning against a lamppost. The city noise seemed far away now, replaced by the sound of laughter, music, and the occasional crackle of a fire. Roberto closed his eyes, trying to block out the memories that flooded his mind. Memories of Christmases spent in sterile boardrooms, of deals closed with a handshake over champagne, of holidays that had become little more than markers of another fiscal year ending. His thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of a musician playing on the street. He turned toward the sound, spotting a man with a weathered guitar sitting on a nearby curb. The musician's fingers moved deftly over the strings, producing a melody that was both haunting and familiar. Roberto couldn't place the tune, but it stirred something deep within him. For a moment, he considered approaching the musician, perhaps even dropping the few coins he had left into the open guitar case at his feet. But he hesitated, feeling the weight of his own pride holding him back. He was Roberto Johnson, after all, a man who had once commanded empires, not someone who stooped to engage with street performers. Yet, as he stood there, watching the musician play, Roberto felt an odd sense of peace. The music, the lights, the laughter of the people around him, it all seemed to melt the icy wall he had built around himself. For the first time in years, he felt invisible, not as a failure but as a man untethered from his past. As the song came to an end, Roberto turned away, pulling his coat tighter around him. The street stretched out before him, quiet and unassuming, a far cry from the polished corridors of power he had once dominated. He didn't know where he was going or what he would find, but for the first time that night, he didn't care. Main Street seemed to invite him to linger, to lose himself in its simplicity, but Roberto wasn't ready yet. The weight of his old life still clung to him, a ghost he couldn't quite shake. And so, he kept walking, letting the cold night swallow him whole as the faint notes of the musician's guitar faded into the distance. The morning came reluctantly, the pale winter sun barely managing to pierce through the thick gray clouds over Chicago. Roberto Johnson, a shadow of the man he had once been, found himself wandering streets he hadn't visited in years. The towering glass buildings of the city's financial district were behind him, replaced by modest brick storefronts and narrow alleys. Snow fell in soft flakes, covering the sidewalks in a thin, pristine layer. Each step was automatic, his body moving without purpose as his mind replayed the chaos of the last 2 days. Fernando's betrayal had hollowed him out, leaving only questions he couldn't answer. How had he missed it? What signs had he ignored? And most pressing of all, why? He had trusted Fernando with everything, shared victories and burdens alike. It wasn't just the money Fernando had taken, it was the certainty Roberto once had in his own ability to judge people. The wind picked up, cutting through Roberto's coat and biting at his skin. He tightened his scarf and shoved his hands deeper into his pockets, but the chill seemed to seep into his very bones. The streets were quieter now, the bustle of last-minute holiday shopping giving way to a calmer rhythm. The city was winding down, preparing for Christmas Eve celebrations, but for Roberto, there was no respite. As he walked, he passed storefronts glowing with warm light. Inside, families and friends gathered around tables laden with food, their laughter spilling out onto the street. The contrast between their joy and his desolation was almost unbearable. Roberto averted his eyes, focusing instead on the icy pavement beneath his feet. He turned down a side street, the noise of the main thoroughfare fading behind him. This was unfamiliar territory, a neighborhood he couldn't name. The buildings here were older, their brick facades worn by time and weather. Many of the shops were closed, their windows darkened, but a few remained open, their lights casting a soft glow onto the snow-covered sidewalk. Roberto stopped in front of a small bookstore, its window display filled with stacks of well-worn novels and twinkling fairy lights. A wooden sign hanging above the door read, "Main Street Books." He stared at the name for a moment, the simplicity of it striking a chord he couldn't quite place. Main Street. It sounded like something out of a childhood story, a place untouched by the chaos of the real world. The smell of roasted chestnuts reached him, carried on the wind from a street vendor further down the block. The scent stirred a memory he hadn't thought of in years, a cold December evening when his father had taken him to a Christmas market. He had been no older than 10, his small hands clutching a paper bag of warm chestnuts as they wandered the stalls together. His father had laughed that night, a deep, warm sound that Roberto could barely remember now. He shook the memory away, his chest tightening. Those moments belonged to a different life, one he had buried long ago. The Roberto Johnson who had strolled through Christmas markets with his father no longer existed. The man standing here now was a failure, a disgrace, the punchline of a joke told across the city. Further down the street, a group of carolers had gathered in front of a small church. Their voices carried through the air, sweet and slightly off-key. Roberto paused to listen, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The song was familiar, one he had heard countless times as a child. But now, it sounded different, its words heavy with a meaning he couldn't quite grasp. As the carolers sang, Roberto noticed the people around him. They weren't the polished professionals he had spent his life surrounded by. These were working-class families, bundled in mismatched coats and scarves, their faces lined with years of hard work and perseverance. A woman held a steaming cup of cocoa, her gloved hand resting on the shoulder of a little boy who clutched a small toy truck. An older man leaned on a cane, nodding along to the music. There was a warmth here, an unspoken connection between the people who had gathered on this street. It wasn't flashy or grand, but it was real. Roberto felt like an intruder, a man who didn't belong in this world of simple joys and quiet solidarity. He turned away, the ache in his chest growing stronger. He continued walking, his footsteps crunching softly in the snow. The streetlights above him cast a golden glow, illuminating the snowflakes as they fell. Roberto's phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't bother checking it. The calls had slowed but hadn't stopped entirely. Each one was a reminder of the life he had left behind, the life that was crumbling piece by piece. As he rounded a corner, he came across a small park, its benches dusted with snow. A single lamppost stood in the center, its light flickering slightly. Roberto sat down on one of the benches, ignoring the cold seeping through his coat. For the first time in hours, he let himself stop moving. The quiet of the park was almost overwhelming. He could hear the faint rustle of the wind through the bare trees, the distant sound of carolers still singing, and the occasional laughter of children playing in the snow. It was a stark contrast to the noise that had consumed his life for so long, the ringing of phones, the clinking of glasses at corporate events, the endless hum of ambition. Roberto leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His breath fogged the air in front of him as he stared at the ground. He thought of Fernando again, the man who had been his partner, his closest ally. How long had Fernando been planning his betrayal? Had there been moments when he had hesitated, when he had considered stopping? Or had it been easy for him to walk away, to take everything and leave Roberto with nothing? The questions churned in Roberto's mind, each one more painful than the last. He felt the familiar stirrings of anger, but it was quickly overtaken by a deep, gnawing sadness. The betrayal wasn't just a professional blow, it was personal. Fernando had been one of the few people Roberto had trusted, and that trust had been shattered. The wind picked up again, swirling the snow around him. Roberto pulled his coat tighter, his fingers stiff with cold. He knew he couldn't stay here forever, but he didn't know where else to go. His apartment felt empty, a cavernous space filled with reminders of a life that no longer fit him. The office was out of the question, a place now tainted by scandal and failure. For the first time in his life, Roberto Johnson had nowhere to go. No plan, no strategy, no sense of direction. He was a man untethered, drifting through a world he no longer recognized. As he sat there, the lights of the city twinkling in the distance, a thought occurred to him, a faint, fleeting idea that he couldn't quite grasp. Perhaps this was the beginning of something, not just an end. Perhaps losing everything would force him to see what he had been blind to for so long, but the thought slipped away as quickly as it had come, leaving only the cold and the quiet behind. Roberto stood, brushing the snow from his coat, and began walking again. The street stretched out before him, endless and empty, offering no answers, only more questions. The bitter cold had settled into Roberto Johnson's bones as the evening deepened. He had been walking aimlessly for what felt like hours, his mind numb and his body on autopilot. The streets of Main Street were quiet now, most of the families having retreated indoors. Only the occasional flicker of candlelight through frosted windows hinted at life beyond the darkened storefronts. His breath puffed in small clouds as he trudged forward, the once pristine snow now a slushy mess beneath his expensive, ruined shoes. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of his failure was physically dragging him down. But he kept moving, too restless to stop and too aimless to have a destination. Then he heard it, the faint sound of music cutting through the night air. It was faint at first, just a few melancholic notes carried on the wind. Roberto paused, straining to locate the source. The melody was hauntingly familiar, a tune he couldn't name but felt he had known all his life. It wasn't polished or perfect, the notes wavered slightly, the rhythm uneven. Yet there was something raw and genuine about it, something that stopped him in his tracks. That he followed the sound, his footsteps crunching softly in the snow. Around the corner, he found the musician. A man, bundled in layers of mismatched clothing, sat on the curb with a battered guitar resting on his lap. His fingers moved deftly over the strings despite the cold, plucking out a tune that seemed to linger in the air long after each note had faded. The musician's face was weathered, his skin roughened by years of exposure to the elements. His eyes, partially hidden beneath the brim of a woolen hat, were focused intently on his instrument. A tattered guitar case lay open at his feet, a few crumpled bills and coins scattered inside. Roberto stood a few feet away, unsure of what to do. He didn't want to disturb the man, but he couldn't bring himself to walk away either. The music held him in place, each note stirring something deep within him. It was a feeling he couldn't name, a mix of nostalgia, sorrow, and a strange, fragile hope. As the song ended, the musician looked up and met Roberto's gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man gave a small nod, as if acknowledging Roberto's presence, and began playing again. This time, the tune was softer, slower, the kind of melody that seemed to wrap around the listener like a warm blanket. Without thinking, Roberto reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handful of coins. They were the last remnants of cash he had on him, change he had kept from a coffee shop earlier in the day. He stepped forward and dropped the coins into the guitar case, the metallic clink breaking the quiet. "Thank you," the musician said, his voice rough but sincere. He paused his playing and looked up at Roberto again, his eyes sharp and discerning. "You look like a man who's had a hard day." Roberto gave a bitter laugh, the sound escaping before he could stop it. "That's one way to put it," he replied, his voice low. The musician tilted his head, studying him for a moment. "You know," he said, plucking a few absent-minded notes on the guitar, "hard days have a way of showing you things you've been too busy to see." Roberto frowned, the word striking a nerve. He wanted to dismiss them, to brush off the musician's attempt at wisdom, but something about the man's tone stopped him. It wasn't condescending or pitying, it was matter of fact, as if he were stating a truth Roberto had yet to realize. "What do you mean?" Roberto asked before he could stop himself. The musician smiled faintly, his fingers never stopping their dance across the strings. When you lose what you thought mattered, you start noticing the things you've been ignoring. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's bad. But it's always real. Roberto didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to. Instead, he let the music fill the silence between them. The musician played another song, this one slower and more mournful. It reminded Roberto of his childhood, of Christmases spent in a small, cozy house with his parents. He could almost smell the pine from the tree his father used to drag in from the lot, the scent mixing with the warmth of his mother's baking. For the first time in years, Roberto felt the ache of something he had long forgotten. It wasn't regret, exactly, or even nostalgia. It was the longing for a version of himself that no longer existed, the boy who had laughed at silly jokes, who had believed in magic, who had once been content without wealth or power. When the song ended, Roberto realized his hands had been trembling. He shoved them into his coat pockets, trying to steady himself. "That song," he said quietly, it's beautiful." The musician nodded, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's an old one. My father used to play it for me when I was a kid." Roberto looked away, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He didn't know what to say, how to bridge the gap between the man he was now and the man he had once been. "Do you want to hear another?" the musician asked, breaking the silence. Roberto hesitated, then nodded. The musician began to play again, and Roberto sat down on the curb a few feet away, the cold seeping into him as he listened. For the next several minutes, Roberto allowed himself to be still, to simply exist in the moment. The music seemed to strip away the noise in his mind, leaving only the raw, unfiltered truth of his emotions. He felt small and vulnerable, but also strangely at peace. When the song ended, the musician looked at him again. "You're carrying a lot," he said simply. Roberto didn't deny it. He didn't have the energy to. Instead, he let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging under the weight of everything he had been holding in. "Yeah," he said finally. "I am." The musician nodded, as if that were all the answer he needed. He began to pack up his guitar, his movements slow and deliberate. Roberto watched him, feeling a pang of regret as the music faded into memory.as. The musician stood, slinging the guitar over his shoulder. He gave Roberto one last look. "Take care of yourself," he said. "And don't forget, sometimes, it's the hard days that show you what really matters." Roberto didn't respond, but the words stayed with him as he watched the musician walk away, his figure disappearing into the snowy night. For the first time in a long time, Roberto felt something stir inside him. It wasn't hope, not yet. But it was the faintest glimmer of possibility, a whisper of change carried on the cold winter wind. Roberto sat on the curb long after the musician had disappeared into the snowy streets. The cold had numbed his body, but his mind buzzed with fragments of the conversation and the music he had just heard. He couldn't remember the last time he had spoken to someone without pretense, without trying to impress or manipulate. It was unsettling, and yet, it left him feeling strangely lighter. The street was quieter now, the bustling sounds of earlier replaced by the occasional crunch of footsteps or the distant jingle of a bell. Main Street had emptied as families retreated into their homes, their silhouettes visible through glowing windows. Roberto could see them laughing, talking, passing plates of food. Each scene was a small tableau of warmth and connection. Worlds away from the cold isolation, he felt that he rose to his feet, brushing snow from his coat, and began to walk again. His steps were slower this time, his thoughts less frantic. The lights on the trees lining the street twinkled faintly, casting a soft glow over the snow-covered sidewalk. Roberto couldn't help but notice the care that had gone into the decorations, the strings of lights meticulously hung, the garlands wrapped around lampposts, the candles placed in windows. It was modest, nothing like the extravagant displays he was used to, but it felt more genuine. As he passed a narrow alleyway, he heard the sound of voices. Laughter and conversation spilled out onto the street, drawing his attention. Curious, he peered around the corner and saw a small group of people gathered in a courtyard. They had set up a long wooden table, its surface covered with mismatched plates and bowls of food. Strings of lights crisscrossed overhead, their warm glow illuminating the scene. The group was a mix of ages. Children darted around the table, their laughter ringing through the air, while adults stood in clusters, talking and sipping from steaming mugs. Roberto hesitated, unsure if he should approach. He felt like an intruder, an outsider in a moment he had no right to witness. Before he could decide, a woman noticed him. She was older, her gray hair tied back in a loose bun, and her eyes crinkled with warmth as she smiled. "Come on in, don't be shy," she called out, her voice carrying over the noise. Roberto froze, startled by the invitation. He pointed to himself, as if to ask if she had meant him. "Yes, you," she said with a laugh, beckoning him over. "It's Christmas Eve. Nobody should be alone on Christmas Eve." He hesitated, his instinct to decline warring with the part of him that longed for connection. The woman's smile didn't waver, and finally, Roberto nodded. He stepped cautiously into the courtyard, the warmth of the gathering pulling him in despite himself. The woman approached him, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I'm Martha," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her fingers warm against his cold skin. "And you are?" "Roberto," he said, his voice hoarse. "Well, Roberto, you look like you could use a hot meal," Martha said matter-of-factly. She gestured toward the table. "Help yourself. There's plenty to go around." Before he could respond, a young boy ran up, tugging on Martha's sleeve. "Grandma, can we light the candles now?" he asked, his eyes wide with excitement. "In a minute, sweetheart," Martha said, patting his head. She turned back to Roberto. "Make yourself at home." Roberto nodded mutely, still unsure of how he had found himself here. He approached the table, his movements hesitant. The food was simple: roasted vegetables, a pot of stew, freshly baked bread, but the smell was intoxicating. He realized he hadn't eaten all day, his appetite buried under the weight of his thoughts. As he filled a plate, he caught snippets of conversation around him. A man in a heavy coat was telling a story about his childhood Christmases, his voice animated as the others laughed. A woman in a brightly knit scarf was handing out mugs of hot cider, her cheeks flushed from the cold. The children darted in and out of the adults' legs, their laughter unrestrained. Roberto took a seat at the edge of the group, his plate balanced on his knees. He felt out of place, like a spectator rather than a participant. But as he ate, the warmth of the food began to spread through him, and the chatter around him started to feel less foreign. At one point, a man seated nearby turned to him. He was middle-aged, with a kind face and a knit cap pulled low over his ears. "First time here?" he asked. Roberto nodded. "Yeah," he said simply. The man smiled. "We do this every year. It's kind of a tradition around here. Some of us don't have big families, so we make our own." "That's nice," Roberto said, the words feeling inadequate. "It is," the man agreed. He extended a hand. "I'm Peter, by the way." "Roberto," he replied, shaking the man's hand. Peter didn't ask any probing questions, didn't press him for details about who he was or why he was here. Instead, he turned back to the group, pulling Roberto into their conversation with a casual ease. As the night went on, Roberto found himself relaxing. He listened to their stories, their jokes, their small moments of shared history. For the first time in what felt like years, he wasn't calculating, strategizing, or trying to prove himself. He was just there, surrounded by warmth and laughter, his burdens momentarily set aside. When the candles were lit, their soft glow reflected in the faces around him. The group fell quiet, their silence filled with a sense of peace and gratitude. Martha led them in a quiet toast, raising her mug of cider and saying, "To being together. That's what matters most." Roberto raised his mug along with the others, the words settling in his chest like a weight and a balm all at once. Being together. The concept felt foreign to him, a man who had spent so much of his life alone, even in a crowd. But as he looked around at the smiling faces, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. When the evening wound down, Martha pressed a small loaf of bread into his hands as he prepared to leave. "Take this," she said. "A little something for the road." Roberto hesitated, his instinct to refuse warring with the warmth in her expression. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Don't be a stranger," she said, patting his arm. Roberto stepped back onto the street, the sounds of the gathering fading behind him. He felt a strange mixture of emotions. He was still lost, still grappling with the wreckage of his life. But for the first time, he felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The bread in his hands was warm, the streetlights above casting a soft glow over the snow. Main Street stretched out before him, quiet and inviting, a reminder that even in the coldest moments, there was still warmth to be found. Roberto awoke on Christmas morning to the pale, diffused light of winter filtering through the blinds of his apartment. The silence was deafening. No hum of a bustling city felt present inside these walls, no chatter of voices, no warmth of another soul. His bed, sprawling and empty, felt as vast and cold as his life had become. He sat up slowly, his head heavy with the events of the previous days. Fernando's betrayal still weighed on him like an anchor, dragging him into a sea of doubt and bitterness. But as he pulled himself from the bed, one detail cut through the haze of despair: the memory of Main Street, the laughter of the families, the warmth of the food, and the simple, genuine interactions of the night before lingered in his mind like a distant melody. For hours, he had sat among strangers, sharing stories, food, and fleeting moments of connection. They hadn't known his name, his history, or his failure. They had seen him only as he was in that moment, a man in need of a little light in the darkness. As he showered and dressed, he found himself drawn back to the memory of the candles, their soft glow illuminating the faces of the people who had welcomed him without hesitation. He had spent years chasing the approval of boardrooms and shareholders, surrounding himself with people who valued his success as long as it benefited them. Yet the quiet acceptance he had felt in that courtyard had touched something inside him he didn't fully understand. The streets outside were nearly empty as he made his way back to Main Street. Snow fell softly, blanketing the city in a quiet stillness. The festive lights still twinkled above, but there was a peace in the air that felt different from the bustling chaos of the days leading up to Christmas. When he arrived at the courtyard, it was quiet, the remnants of the previous night's celebration scattered like clues to a mystery. Empty mugs sat on the table, now dusted with snow, and the strings of lights swayed gently in the wind. Roberto stood there for a moment, unsure of why he had come. He had no reason to expect anyone to be here, no promise of welcome or warmth. "Back again, I see." The voice startled him, and he turned to see Martha standing near the doorway of a small bakery that bordered the courtyard. She was bundled in a thick coat and scarf, her hands gloved and her cheeks pink from the cold. Roberto gave her a sheepish smile. "I wasn't sure if anyone would be here. Most folks are inside with their families," she said, walking toward him. "But I always come out to tidy up after our little gatherings. Can't let the snow bury everything, now can we?" She waved him over to the bakery, pushing the door open and motioning for him to follow. The warmth inside hit him immediately, a stark contrast to the chill outside. The smell of freshly baked bread and pastries filled the air, and Roberto felt his shoulders relax for the first time that morning. Martha led him to a small table near the window, setting down 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "I saw how you were last night," she said, sitting across from him. "You seemed heavy, like you were carrying the world on your shoulders." Roberto looked down at his hands, unsure of how to respond. Martha didn't press him, sipping her coffee quietly as she waited for him to find his words. "I guess I am," he said finally, his voice low. "I've lost a lot recently. Things I thought I couldn't live without." Martha nodded, her expression kind but thoughtful. "Funny how life works, isn't it? Sometimes it takes losing what we thought mattered to see what really does." Her words echoed those of the street musician from the night before, and Roberto felt a pang of recognition. "You sound like that musician I met last night," he said. Martha smiled. "That's Walter. He's a good soul. Knows more about the world than most folks with fancy degrees. Roberto couldn't help but chuckle at that. He thought of the endless hours he had spent in boardrooms, surrounded by men and women with expensive educations and sharp suits, all of them so sure of their importance. Walter, with his battered guitar and humble wisdom, had managed to make more of an impact on him in one night than any of them ever had. As they talked, other customers began trickling into the bakery, their voices filling the space with warmth and energy. Martha greeted each one by name, her smile unwavering as she handed out loaves of bread and cups of coffee. Roberto watched her, struck by the ease with which she connected with everyone who walked through the door. When the morning rush had subsided, Martha returned to the table, setting down a small plate of pastries. "You know," she said, "everyone has a story. Last night, I could see you were holding on to yours pretty tightly. But sometimes, sharing it makes it a little easier to carry." Roberto hesitated, the instinct to keep his struggles to himself warring with the growing desire to let someone in. Finally, he began to speak. He told her about Fernando, about the betrayal that had gutted him and left him adrift. He spoke of the empire he had built and how quickly it had begun to crumble, how the life he had worked so hard for now felt hollow and meaningless. Martha listened quietly, her expression thoughtful but never judgmental. When he finished, she reached across the table and placed a hand over his. "That's a lot for one man to carry," she said gently. "But you don't have to carry it alone." Roberto felt his throat tighten, and he nodded, unable to speak. As the day wore on, more people from the community began to gather in the bakery, their voices weaving together in a tapestry of shared stories and laughter. Roberto found himself drawn into their conversations, listening as they spoke of their lives, their struggles, and their joys. There was Peter, the man he had met the night before, who shared stories of his years as a factory worker and the pride he took in his children's accomplishments. There was Maria, a single mother who spoke of her efforts to provide for her daughter while pursuing her dream of becoming a chef. And there was Walter, the musician, who arrived late in the afternoon with his guitar slung over his shoulder and a song on his lips. Each person had their own challenges, their own burdens to bear. Yet they carried them with a resilience and grace that left Roberto in awe. They had so little compared to what he had once possessed, yet they seemed infinitely richer in the things that truly mattered. As the sun began to set, Roberto realized he didn't want to leave. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged, not because of his wealth or status, but simply because he was there, sharing in the lives of these people. When it was time to go, Martha hugged him tightly, her warmth grounding him. "You're always welcome here," she said. "Don't be a stranger." Roberto nodded, his chest tight with gratitude. As he stepped back out into the snowy street, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was a start. It was hope. The early hours of Christmas Day were unusually still, the city blanketed in a hushed calm. Snow fell lightly, softening the edges of the streets and buildings, as if trying to give the world a fresh start. Roberto Johnson walked through Main Street, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The night's events replayed in his mind, the warmth of the community, the laughter, the stories, the music. Each memory felt like a faint ember, warming something inside him he had long thought extinguished. For years, he had measured his life in terms of victories, deals closed, assets acquired, profits made. The moments of genuine connection he had experienced in the last 2 days were unlike anything he could recall. They weren't tied to wealth, power, or ambition. They were simpler, softer, and yet they felt more substantial. The snow crunched beneath his shoes as he walked. Main Street was quiet now, its decorations glinting faintly in the first light of dawn. He paused near the courtyard where he had spent Christmas Eve, the remnants of the gathering still visible. A few chairs remained scattered, their legs dusted with snow, and the strings of lights above swayed gently in the breeze. He stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet settle around him. The thoughts that had plagued him for days, the betrayal, the scandal, the humiliation, still lingered, but they felt muted now, less oppressive. He had spent so much time chasing something he couldn't even name, and for what? The fortune he had amassed had crumbled in a matter of hours, and the empire he had built was little more than a fragile illusion. As he stared at the empty courtyard, memories of his childhood crept into his mind. He thought of his parents, of the small but warm Christmases they had shared in their modest home. There had been no extravagant gifts or elaborate feasts, just the comfort of being together. His father's deep laugh, his mother's gentle hands as she prepared dinner, the way the house had seemed to glow with a quiet, unassuming joy, all of it felt so far away now, like a story he had once read and almost forgotten. Roberto clenched his fists, his breath hitching. Somewhere along the way, he had lost that version of himself, the boy who had been content with so little, who had known how to find joy in simple things. The man he had become was a stranger, someone who had traded connection for control, love for leverage. The faint sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Walter, the street musician, approaching with his guitar slung over his shoulder. The older man gave him a small nod of recognition, his breath visible in the cold air. Couldn't sleep either, huh? Walter said, stopping a few feet away. Roberto shook his head. Too much on my mind. Walter smiled faintly and gestured to one of the snow-dusted chairs. Mind if I join you? Roberto nodded, and they both sat down. Walter set his guitar on his lap, his fingers idly strumming a few soft notes. You look different today, Walter said after a moment. How so? Lighter, maybe, Walter said, his tone thoughtful. Like you've put something down. Roberto frowned, considering the observation. I don't know if I have, he admitted. But last night, it felt like a glimpse of something I've been missing. Something I didn't even realize I'd lost. Walter nodded, his fingers still moving over the strings. It's funny how that happens, isn't it? You spend your whole life chasing something, and then you stumble across it in the last place you'd expect. Roberto didn't respond right away. Instead, he watched the light slowly brighten the horizon, painting the snow in soft hues of pink and gold. The world felt new, untouched, as if it were offering him a chance to start over. You ever feel like you've wasted too much time? Roberto asked finally, his voice quiet. Walter stopped playing, looking at him with an expression that was both kind and knowing. Everyone feels that way at some point, he said. But the thing about time is, it's not about how much you've used, it's about what you do with what you've got left. The words hit Roberto harder than he expected. He thought of all the time he had spent building his empire, the countless hours sacrificed at the altar of ambition. For what? To end up here, a man undone by his own choices, standing on the edge of a life he barely recognized. I don't even know where to start, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Walter smiled. You've already started, he said simply. You showed up. Sometimes, that's all it takes. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sound the faint creak of the swaying lights above them. The sun continued its slow ascent, its light spilling over the rooftops and casting long shadows on the snow. Finally, Walter stood, slinging his guitar back over his shoulder. You'll figure it out, he said, his tone certain. Just don't forget what you felt these last couple of days. Hold on to it. That's the important part. Roberto nodded, watching as Walter walked away, his footsteps crunching softly in the snow. For a long time, Roberto remained in the courtyard, his mind quieter than it had been in days. He thought of Martha's words, of the stories he had heard the night before, of the kindness that had been extended to him without expectation. When he finally rose, the sun was higher in the sky, its warmth chasing away some of the chill. As he walked back toward his apartment, he felt the faintest flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. That it wasn't resolution, not yet. The pain of Fernando's betrayal and the fallout of his failure still loomed large, but they no longer felt insurmountable. Beneath them was something deeper, something that felt like the beginning of a way forward. That it was fragile and uncertain, but it was there, a seed of hope, planted in the cold soil of his despair. And for the first time in a long time, Roberto allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it could grow. The days following Christmas passed slowly, each one marked by a quiet that Roberto Johnson had never known. The frantic calls from investors and reporters had dwindled, though their demands still loomed in the background. He kept his phone silenced, the weight of their messages resting heavily in his pocket. For the first time in years, he had stopped fighting to control every piece of his life. Instead, he spent his time walking through Main Street, revisiting the places and people that had offered him a rare glimpse of peace. The bakery, with its warm, golden light spilling out into the street, had become a kind of refuge. Martha always greeted him with a knowing smile and a fresh cup of coffee, her gentle presence grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. The others he had met during the Christmas Eve gathering had begun to feel familiar, their lives and stories weaving into the fabric of his own. There was Peter, who had introduced him to the small community garden at the edge of the neighborhood, where volunteers worked year-round to grow food for those in need. Maria, the aspiring chef, had convinced Roberto to join her for one of her cooking classes, an experience that had left him laughing for the first time in months. And then there was Walter, the street musician, whose songs seemed to linger in the air long after he had finished playing. They often sat together in the courtyard, their conversations meandering from music to life to the small, unexpected joys they had each discovered. It was in these moments, surrounded by people who asked for nothing and gave everything, that Roberto began to see his life with a clarity he had never known. On the morning of New Year's Eve, as snow fell softly outside his apartment window, Roberto received a phone call he couldn't ignore. It was from his lawyer, the voice on the other end crisp and businesslike. "Fernando has been found," the lawyer said. Roberto froze, the name hitting him like a sudden gust of cold air. "He's agreed to a settlement," the lawyer continued. "We've recovered a significant portion of the funds. It won't cover everything, but it's enough to stabilize the situation. The board is considering their next steps, but they'll want to hear from you soon." The words hung in the air long after the call ended. Fernando had been caught. The money was returning. The nightmare that had consumed his life for weeks seemed, at least on the surface, to be reaching a conclusion. But as Roberto sat there, staring out at the snowy city, he felt none of the satisfaction he had expected. He had imagined this moment over and over, the vindication, the relief, the sense of triumph. Yet now that it was here, all he felt was exhaustion. His lawyer's parting words echoed in his mind, "They'll want to hear from you soon." For years, his voice had commanded rooms, shaped deals, and sealed fates. But now, the thought of returning to that world, of stepping back into the boardrooms and negotiations that had once defined him, filled him with dread. He spent the rest of the day walking, his footsteps crunching softly in the snow. Main Street was quiet, the festive decorations still hanging in the windows and on the lampposts. The community was preparing for a modest New Year's celebration in the courtyard, and Roberto had been invited. As he passed the bakery, Martha stepped outside, brushing flour from her hands. "You coming tonight?" she asked, her voice light but expectant. Roberto hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be there." She smiled, giving his arm a reassuring squeeze. "Good. It wouldn't be the same without you." That evening, the courtyard came alive once again. Strings of lights swayed gently in the wind, and the tables were laden with simple dishes brought by the neighbors. A small fire crackled in a barrel at the center, its warmth drawing people close. Roberto arrived quietly, nodding to the familiar faces as he made his way to the edge of the gathering. Peter waved him over, handing him a cup of hot cider. "Glad you made it," Peter said. "Me too," Roberto replied, the words carrying more weight than he intended. As the evening wore on, the crowd began to thin, families retreating to their homes to welcome the new year. Roberto found himself sitting near the fire, Walter's guitar filling the quiet with soft, soothing notes. Martha joined him, her presence as steady and reassuring as ever. She didn't say anything at first, letting the music and the crackle of the fire fill the space between them. "You've been quiet tonight," she said finally, her voice gentle. "I've had a lot to think about," Roberto admitted. Martha tilted her head, studying him. "Anything you want to share?" Roberto hesitated, then nodded. He told her about the call from his lawyer, about the money, the board, and the questions that now loomed over his future. "They'll expect me to go back," he said. "To pick up where I left off, to rebuild everything I lost." "And what do you want?" Martha asked. Roberto was silent for a long moment. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I'm not sure I can go back to that life." Not after everything I've seen here. Martha smiled, her expression soft. Change is hard, she said. But sometimes, it's the only way forward. As midnight approached, the remaining neighbors gathered around the fire, their faces glowing in the flickering light. Martha led them in a quiet toast, raising her cup of cider and saying, "To new beginnings." The words resonated deeply with Roberto. As he raised his own cup, he felt a shift inside him, a sense of resolve taking root. The New Year's countdown began, the voices around him growing louder with each passing second. As the clock struck midnight, cheers erupted, and Roberto found himself smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile. In that moment, he knew. He couldn't return to the life he had built, the life that had broken him. But he could build something new. That he looked around at the faces of the people who had shown him kindness, who had welcomed him into their lives without hesitation. And for the first time, he saw not just a community but an opportunity, a chance to give back, to create something meaningful, to be a part of something bigger than himself. As the first moments of the new year unfolded, Roberto felt the weight of his old life begin to lift. He didn't have all the answers, but he had something far more valuable, a sense of purpose, and for the first time in years, he felt ready to embrace it. The new year dawned with a rare clarity for Roberto Johnson. For years, he had risen each morning with his mind already buzzing with tasks and strategies, every moment a step toward maintaining or expanding his empire. But this morning was different. His thoughts were calm, his priorities realigned. The weight of his past life, while still present, had shifted. Instead of an anchor, it now felt like a foundation, a place from which to build something new. He spent the first few days of January walking through Main Street, observing the rhythms of the community. He noted the small but significant details, the way Martha's bakery seemed to act as a hub for connection, the quiet persistence of Peter and the others working in the community garden despite the biting cold, and the resilience of Maria, who tirelessly pursued her culinary dreams while caring for her daughter. It was in these moments, surrounded by the tangible struggles and triumphs of the people he had come to know, that Roberto realized the direction he wanted to take. He would rebuild, not his empire, but something that truly mattered. For the first time, the question wasn't what can I gain, but what can I give? One evening, he gathered the community members he had grown close to, inviting them to meet at Martha's bakery after hours. The smell of fresh bread filled the room as the small group sat around the wooden tables, their curiosity evident. "I wanted to talk to all of you," Roberto began, his voice steady but earnest. "You've welcomed me into your lives these past weeks, and I can't thank you enough for that. It's reminded me of what really matters: connection, community, and purpose." The group listened quietly, their faces attentive. "I've spent my life chasing success, building something big," Roberto continued. "But I lost sight of what it means to truly build, to create something that lasts, something that helps others. That's what I want to do now. And I want to do it here, with all of you." Martha tilted her head, her expression warm but questioning. "What exactly are you thinking, Roberto?" "I've been thinking about everything this community has shown me," he said. "There's so much potential here, but it's clear that resources are stretched thin. I want to help change that. I have the means, and now I have the motivation." He outlined his plan, speaking carefully but with growing confidence. He wanted to invest in the community, not through charity but through meaningful, sustainable projects. The bakery could expand, allowing Martha to hire more staff and reach more customers. The community garden could grow, providing fresh produce to more families and teaching others how to cultivate their own. Maria's dream of opening a small restaurant could become a reality, creating jobs and bringing people together over shared meals. "And Walter," Roberto said, turning to the musician, "I think it's time we found a way to share your music with more people. Maybe a community space for artists, somewhere local talent can shine, where people can gather and celebrate creativity." Walter chuckled softly, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "You've been giving this a lot of thought," he said. "I have," Roberto admitted. "But this isn't just about what I think. I want this to be something we do together. Your voices, your ideas, they're what matter most. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Roberto's words sinking in. Then Peter spoke, his voice thoughtful. "It's a generous idea, Roberto. But we've all seen promises come and go, especially when money's involved. How do we know this is real?" Roberto met Peter's gaze, his expression serious. "I know I've made mistakes, more than I can count. But I'm not here to make promises I can't keep. I'm here because I believe in what this community stands for. And I'm willing to put in the work to prove it." Martha nodded slowly, her face softening. "If you're serious about this, Roberto, I think you'll find we're serious, too." The meeting ended with cautious optimism, the group agreeing to continue the conversation in the days ahead. As Roberto left the bakery that night, the cold air felt less biting, the world around him brighter. For the first time, he felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to wealth or power. It was tied to people, with real lives and dreams. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Roberto threw himself into the work, collaborating with the community to bring the projects to life. He spent hours at the garden with Peter, learning about the soil and the seasons, and how even the smallest seed could grow into something extraordinary. At the bakery, he worked alongside Martha, helping her plan the expansion and hire new staff. The smell of fresh bread and the sound of laughter filled the space, a reminder of the warmth that had drawn him to this place in the first place. With Maria, he visited vacant storefronts, imagining what her restaurant could look like. Her excitement was infectious, and Roberto found himself sketching ideas late into the night, inspired by her vision. Walter, ever the skeptic, took longer to convince. But when Roberto helped secure a small venue for a community concert, the musicians' resistance began to wane. The concert was a resounding success, the room filled with music, laughter, and applause. For Roberto, it was a moment of affirmation, a glimpse of what could be achieved when people came together. News of Roberto's efforts began to spread, and with it came a mix of reactions. Some viewed him with suspicion, questioning his motives. Others saw him as a man seeking redemption, using his resources to make amends. For Roberto, the opinions mattered less than the work itself. Each day brought new challenges, but also new connections, new moments of growth. He began to see himself not as a man trying to escape his past, but as someone building a future, one rooted in community, compassion, and purpose. One evening, as he stood in the courtyard watching the lights twinkle above, Roberto felt a deep sense of contentment. The bakery was bustling, the garden thriving, and Maria's restaurant was weeks away from opening. Walter was rehearsing for another concert, and Peter had already started planning the next season's crops. This wasn't the life Roberto had imagined for himself. It was quieter, humbler, and infinitely more fulfilling. He had lost so much, but in the process, he had found something far greater. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Roberto smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The courtyard buzzed with quiet energy as the first hints of spring began to peek through the lingering chill of winter. Snow had melted into patches, and the air carried the faint scent of blooming flowers. Roberto Johnson stood near the community garden, his hands covered in dirt as he helped Peter plant a new row of seedlings. Peter handed him another small plant, a sprig of basil ready to take root in its new home. "You've gotten good at this," Peter said with a grin. Roberto chuckled, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Don't tell Martha," he joked. "She'll start asking me to make pesto for the bakery." Peter laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. It was the kind of easy camaraderie Roberto had come to cherish, a far cry from the guarded, transactional relationships he'd once known. Here, there were no boardroom deals, no fine print, only honest work and genuine connection. The garden had transformed over the past few months, much like the community itself. The neat rows of vegetables and herbs were thriving, their vibrant green leaves a testament to the care and collaboration of the people who tended them. Families came regularly to help, and Peter had started hosting workshops for local children, teaching them how to grow their own food. Roberto stepped back, surveying the garden with a sense of pride and fulfillment. This wasn't just a plot of land, it was a symbol of what the community had built together, a place where seeds of hope had been planted, both literally and figuratively. As the morning wore on, Roberto made his way to the bakery. The door jingled as he entered, and the familiar aroma of fresh bread enveloped him. Martha was behind the counter, her sleeves rolled up and her hands dusted with flour. "You're just in time," she called out, waving him over. "For what?" Roberto asked, leaning against the counter. "For this," Martha said, sliding a plate of warm, golden pastries toward him. "Our first batch of empanadas. Maria's recipe." Roberto picked one up, taking a careful bite. The flaky crust gave way to a rich, flavorful filling, and he couldn't help but smile. "She's outdone herself," he said. "She's just getting started," Martha replied. "Her restaurant's opening in 2 weeks, and if this is any indication, it's going to be a hit." Roberto nodded, a wave of satisfaction washing over him. Helping Maria turn her dream into a reality had been one of the most rewarding parts of his journey. The vacant storefront they'd chosen was now alive with color and energy, the windows painted with cheerful designs and the interior transformed into a cozy, inviting space. Maria had poured her heart into every detail, from the menu to the decor, and Roberto had been there every step of the way, not as a financier but as a friend. It was her vision, her passion, but he had been proud to support her as she brought it to life. As he left the bakery, Roberto walked toward the small venue they had repurposed for community events. Today, it was hosting an art show featuring local talent, an idea Walter had proposed during one of their many conversations. The once vacant building had become a vibrant hub of creativity, its walls adorned with paintings, photographs, and sculptures. Roberto stepped inside, the hum of conversation filling the air as neighbors mingled and admired the artwork. Walter was near the front, strumming his guitar as a small group of children listened intently. He caught Roberto's eye and gave him a nod, his smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "You made it," Walter said, setting his guitar aside. "Wouldn't miss it," Roberto replied, glancing around the room. "This is incredible." "It's all them," Walter said, gesturing to the artists scattered throughout the venue. "They just needed a place to shine." Roberto couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder at how far they had come. Main Street, once quiet and unassuming, was now alive with possibility. The projects they had undertaken weren't just improving the community, they were transforming it, creating opportunities and connections that would last for years to come. As the afternoon wore on, Roberto found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of Fernando, of the betrayal that had once felt like the end of everything he had built. He thought of the night spent wandering the cold streets, searching for meaning in the aftermath of his downfall, and then he thought of the people who had welcomed him, who had shown him kindness when he had nothing to offer in return. Martha, Peter, Maria, Walter, they had been his anchors, his guides, his inspiration. They had reminded him of what truly mattered, of the simple joys and profound connections that made life worth living. As evening approached, the community gathered once again in the courtyard. Strings of lights twinkled above, casting a warm glow over the tables filled with food and laughter. Roberto stood near the fire, a mug of cider in hand, as the familiar sounds of Walter's guitar filled the air. Martha joined him, her expression soft and content. "You've done a lot for this place," she said. Roberto shook his head. "We've done it together," he said. "I wouldn't have gotten here without all of you." Martha smiled. "Maybe. But you made a choice to be here, to stay, to give back. That matters, Roberto. Don't sell yourself short." Her words stayed with him as the night unfolded, the courtyard alive with celebration. For the first time in years, Roberto felt truly at peace, not because of what he had achieved, but because of who he had become. As the stars appeared in the sky, Roberto looked around at the faces of the people who had become his family. They weren't bound by blood or contracts or obligations, but by something deeper, a shared commitment to each other, to their community, to the possibility of a better future. And for the first time, Roberto didn't feel like he was chasing something. He didn't feel the gnawing need for more, the endless hunger that had driven him for so long that he felt whole. As the fire crackled and the music played, Roberto raised his mug, a smile spreading across his face. To Main Street, he said, his voice carrying through the night. To Main Street, the crowd echoed, their voices warm and full of promise, and in that moment, beneath the twinkling lights and the vast expanse of the starry sky, Roberto Johnson knew he had found his place in the world. A new beginning, built not on wealth or power, but on hope, community, and the simple, enduring joy of being part of something greater than himself. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your favorite part in the comments below. Your support means so much to us. See you in the next video.